Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of 17 Minutes of Science. Thank you again for joining us today. For those of you tuning in for the first time, my name is Anna Milinkovich, and I am a Technical Solutions and Application Scientist with In Vivo Biosystems. Joining me this week is Hannah Kistner, and our discussion today will focus on a combination of education, ecology, and environmental systems, and at least one way that we as a community can adapt to learning during a pandemic. So Hannah is an ecology researcher, environmental educator, and conservation biologist who's currently working with the Santa Barbara Adventure Company. She has extensive experience working with homeschooled children and families, and specifically in science and biology related fields. So as part of both her current work and prior position with the Santa Barbara Zoo, Hannah's crafted custom homeschool curriculums for biology, and those are primarily centered around experiential learning, which is a new concept to me, but I'm very excited to chat about. And of course, her expertise now is more essential than ever as communities try to navigate distance learning due to COVID-19. So without further ado, welcome, Hannah. I'll drop it over to you. You can give us, some words about yourself, and then we can get into some questions from our audience and our team.
Sweet, thanks. I'm so happy to be here. I really appreciate you guys inviting me to join today. Yeah, I think let's just jump into the questions and we can go from there.
Sure. Yeah, I've got my handy dandy 17-minute timer set. So I guess a very broad question is, how did you start working with homeschool families, and kind of how does your work now surround that, or any prior work you've done? Can you share more of what got you there?
For sure. So I studied field biology. I got my bachelor's, and even before I went to university, I was working in a hallway, basically, at a museum, and my entire job was like pinning beetles. So like the museum has probably millions of specimens from collecting trips, and my entire day, hours, months, seasons was spent pinning beetles in this hallway. And then when I went to school, I got to expand my horizons a little bit, got a job doing consulting at our local Air Force base, doing some environmental consulting there. And one of our species of interest was what's called beach laia. And it's a tiny, tiny, tiny flower. Like the flower is probably half the size of my pinky fingernail, and the whole plant is smaller than my pinky. And it grows exclusively on dunes, which are by nature an ever-changing environment. So if you have a gust of wind, like while we're sampling and surveying, we could lose like a whole population just under the sand, which is, the plant is totally fine with that. But as researchers trying to find this rare plant, it was very challenging. And so then I would come home from like 10, 14-hour day of work and try and explain the value of that to people who live in town. And there was a huge disconnect. Like, you kind of have to be in this dune community, which is extremely rare in California now. It's really only in like preserves. A lot of people have never been in a natural coastal dune community. So just that exclusivity was hard, let alone this plant that if you blink, it's gone. So that kind of inspired me to want to get more into education. And I found that there is a huge desire and huge need in the homeschooling community to have professional scientists speaking into their education opportunities. Of course, there are homeschool parents that are incredible scientists, but not every homeschool parent is a scientist or like a well-rounded scientist. So I'm a biologist. I can speak very little into physics or chemistry, but a lot of people are not even a scientist. So I was happy to fill that role and finding that opportunity to connect what I care about, nature, to students that have more flexibility with their learning anyways and are already doing what we call experiential learning. So out in the field, getting your hands dirty, using your 5 senses to learn. That is kind of my happy place as well.
Awesome. Well, yeah, it sounds like a very different experience, to use that same word, than being sitting in a classroom and kind of being lectured at, which is kind of my most recent experience, going through the system. But it kind of, you mentioned it when we spoke earlier, it ties in very well. Kind of children have a very natural curiosity about the world around them. So I'm curious if you can speak to how that maybe shapes some of the curriculums you've developed, kind of maybe bouncing off of their questions, or I know you mentioned, they have great analogies that maybe you or I, in our adult, less creative brains wouldn't have gotten to.
Yeah, totally. I love working with kids, especially outdoors, for all those reasons. It's still going. There is what we call the homeschool science semester that we ran at one of my previous positions that I created all the curriculum for. It was a rotating, multiple semester, 3-year chunk of curriculum, and all the different topics were totally different. And we chose intentionally to not focus on exotic animals, but to use that incredible resource that we had as the zoo to focus on broader concepts that are more applicable to families. So for example, one of our opportunities was to study diet and nutrition, because obviously that affects every living thing. And having a healthy diet and healthy behaviors as a child is going to set you up for success later. So we were able to go into the animal kitchen and help the animal kitchen chefs prep the diets for all of the animals. And then we have the opportunity to learn about what is an herbivore, what is a frugivore, something that only eats fruit, and how would that work with our bodies? What's going to happen if we were frugivores? So we got the kids really involved. And as you mentioned, they're just so open to all of their sensory information and so communicative about that. Generally, it's really easy, I think. I end up finding myself learning just as much from the kids. And then what we would also do is give them assignments at home. And we encourage them to go into their communities, whether it's just in their backyard or in their local park. Or one of the opportunities during that semester was to investigate some of the local sources of seafood and find out if they're sustainably sourced and what that means for the community, what that means for the local economy, where's this seafood coming from and why and how does that happen. And so that actually relates to the resource document that I provided. One of the apps on there is called Seafood Watch. And this is an app designed by Monterey Bay Aquarium. It's super simple. No matter where you are, you can check on the app any kind of seafood you could find in a grocery store, in a market, at a restaurant, and look at the species, how it was fished, and it'll give you a rating on how sustainable that is for fisheries and for our future. So what we had the kids do was they had to find 3 different businesses locally. It could be, their local fish market. It could be the grocery store. It could be their local burger joint that sold fish sandwiches, and just find someone to ask, where does this fish come from? Is it sustainably sourced? And whether or not the kids were using the app to determine it for themselves, just promoting that awareness is huge. And I had families come back to me 2 years later and be like, hey, guess what? My kid, we have to go straight to the seafood section of every grocery store before we do anything else, because they need to know where's all the fish from and is it sustainably sourced? And so that to me is a huge win for our community's future.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a interesting tie-in, and it makes total sense now, having heard you explain it. It's not just the biological world and ecology, but it's the societal ecology, right? So kind of how our community in a non-natural way influences so many other ecosystems, and other communities as well, whether that is, like you mentioned in your sourcing seafood example, whether that is wild caught fish, and of course influencing that wild environment, or how that fish is being brought in, trucked in, flown into whatever state you might happen to be in, and the impact of that transportation on environment, and also the local impact. So are we kind of thinking a little bit broader, I imagine, as these kids grow up, how does this influence maybe even certain jobs in the community or things like that? So that's amazing. That's such a broad reaching kind of topic that you can go all over with.
Yeah, and it's awesome from a coastal community. So the kids could literally go down to our harbor, watch these urchin ships come in, these huge crates of urchins, go to drive less than a mile away, find urchin on the menu, and say, you know, is this from our harbor? Where is it from? You know, how, look at the cost difference. You know, you see a huge container of uni, and on the menu, it's close to $20 for a couple little pieces of the urchin. And so it just gets kids thinking. And also, I think in the community, having questions asked by the youth is more impactful. And it's good for the youth, it's good for the adults that are interacting with them. And I think it's really positive overall.
Yeah. So kind of how do you think this, you mentioned, you know, it's generally positive, but do you think that kind of having just an overall understanding of biology or ecology, you know, influences people's attitude long-term towards environmental conservation, for example?
Certainly, but I would sort of preface it with, it doesn't have to be a formal education. I come from sort of a old school field biology training that is, I can't even tell you how many hours, how many packets of how to write field notes in a field notebook I learned. And that's extremely valuable. And at the end of the day, you don't have to know the Latin name of what you're looking at. It's way more important that you use your senses to describe it well so that someone else who maybe is more of an expert can assist you. And that's what I think biology is all about, is these communities of, you know, scholars, of observers, of naturalists. Any person can use any of their senses to learn about nature. And even if you are outdoors in what seems like a city, there's no cities devoid of life, you know, and at this point, humans are a part of every single ecosystem in the world. So I think that with or without a formal biology education, being outdoors and just being aware of your senses, what sort of things you're seeing, what sort of things you're feeling, it's really going to impact your health, mentally, emotionally, physically. There are so many studies that show being outside is healthy. And it also just gives you time to think. I am a huge fan of backyard bird feeders, and it is incredible how many species of bird will come to a bird feeder, even if you're in the middle of miles and miles of urbanization, a city. And so getting the opportunity to see birds up close is invaluable. That's actually what got me into birding. Is we did a project that's called mist netting. And it's basically kind of like a very delicate net that's put up in a flyaway zone. And all these birds I'd seen before that were getting caught, it was like probably, honestly, a house sparrow, which is like on every continent in the whole world. But just being able to, basically the birds fly into the net, get tangled a little bit, and then you immediately go and get them untangled and then take measurements or whatever you need for that study. Being able to hold a bird in hand, not that I'm recommending people go out and grab birds, but being able to hold a bird in hand and just see how minuscule their feathers are, that changed my life. And I mean, anyone could have that experience, you know, being close to nature, observing things that you haven't had the opportunity to see before. That's what's most important. And those things are going to stick with you, those emotional experiences, those things that you sense directly.
Yeah. No, that's a great example, just kind of being able to touch something and being open to the questions that it evokes in you, right? So yeah. Kind of to your bird example too, you know, I'll take the dog for a walk or hike in the woods and find a bird feather and be like, you know, I've never seen this before, and I have a collection that's sitting in a jar, you know, and on my kitchen counter, just as a visual piece. But it's also, you know, I'll take a picture, I'll see if I can find it online. And I do it the old school way. I just like kind of go through pictures, but I think to touch back on something we discussed earlier is you mentioned that there's a resource for this too, is if you just snap a picture of something you're interested in and the community will help kind of source the answer for you, right?
Yeah, so that's actually my like social media vibe. I am on this app called iNaturalist, and it is a network internationally of people with cameras that want to know what they're seeing. So I have it on my phone. You don't need a phone. It can be a desktop experience. But basically you can take a picture of anything alive and post it. And the identification software in the program will actually usually suggest something that's pretty close. Like it says something like, oh, we think this might be in the fig tree family. And you're like, yeah, I think so. But I have no idea what species it is. So you can just post it, identify it as much as you want. And then there are all levels of biologists on this app. And they have, like, for example, I've had identifications by someone that described the species originally, our local native plant. Then Dieter Wilken comes on and he's like, yep, that's what it is. I'm like, yes, I knew it. I'm so glad. But then you have like just your next door neighbor who there's literally a person on iNat that's their username is really funny. And I think they live in my neighborhood because they have a ton of observations like around this house in my neighborhood. And this person does a ton of identifications with me and I do the same thing for them. And basically how it works is each observation has a different grade of integrity. So it can go from needs ID to research grade observation. And this is all facilitated by the community there. And it's totally open to youth, highly recommend it. It's just a way also to categorize what you've seen, and it keeps track of all the species you've seen, how many you've seen. Yeah, it's just an incredible resource. And it's called iNaturalist. It's run by the Natural History Museum in Los Angeles. And again, it's international. You can use it anywhere.
Awesome. That's amazing. That's literally at your fingertips. And
yeah.
I love the concept that it is, you know, pulling from the brains of anybody that wants to contribute, right? So that's awesome. And I'm going to apologize. I think I'm jumping around a little bit, but we skipped a question dealing with ecological interpretation. So can you maybe touch on that and explain what that entails?
Yeah, definitely. So ecological interpretation, just breaking it down, ecology is a network of all the living and non-living things in an environment, how they interact, what are those relationships. Interpretation is taking something that someone doesn't understand and as an expert, turning it into something that is understandable through communication. So it doesn't always have to be a person. You can have an interpretive sign, but basically putting them together as an ecological interpreter, I help people understand the relationships that you are experiencing in nature or witnessing in nature. So, for example, there's a lot of interpreters that are employed by the National Park System. They're actually one of the organizations that kind of established this certification system for interpreters. And you'll meet them everywhere if you go to a national park. It's the volunteers, all the rangers are trained in it. And it's a benefit to the people that are visiting so that you can get just kind of that extra information to support what you're observing. So obviously, everyone should go to nature and experience it for themselves. But how much cooler is it when you know a little bit of history behind it, you know? I just found out that one of the beaches I go to, there's a patch of cactus. And I just learned through this website that that patch of cactus has like 100-year history and has to do with World War II and the oil industry. And I would have never known. I thought it was kind of just someone threw out their, you know, cactus leaf and it just blossomed and there we are. But that interpretation provided for me extra context that makes it more meaningful. So that is the value of ecological interpretation. And I think one of the best ways to access ecological interpretation is through citizen science programs. And citizen science is exactly what it sounds like. It is open to all people, not just citizens, but it's open to anyone. And it's legitimate science. iNaturalist is a great example of that. Anyone can contribute, and the data is used on all levels. There are postdoctoral researchers that are using iNaturalist data to confirm sightings or to confirm species ranges or what have you. So citizen science is a way that everyone can get involved, no matter your age, no matter your gender, no matter your religion, no matter anything. And you have sort of a foot in the door in the science world.
That's awesome. Thank you very much. And you must have heard the timer go off, so I'll leave with one last kind of question or point. And you touched on it already, is we have a quote from you that says, when humans connect with nature, it naturally results in more sustainable communities and healthier environments. And I think you touched on this a lot already, but kind of from your experience and what you'd like to share with us, kind of what resources have you seen or what resources might you have that would help foster this connection?
Yeah, so I recommend kind of finding something that you're interested in. So for me, I'm interested in a lot of things. Let's pick local wildlife, especially mammals. And I guarantee you there's a citizen science program for you to get involved. And the more involved you are in something, the more you invest your time, let alone if you invest money, you're going to care more. And so the more that people, especially youth, are able to invest in nature, the more we're going to care, and the more nature is going to take care of us. So there's this concept called ecosystem services, which is basically the way nature takes care of itself, and humans, being a part of the ecological system, are also cared for. So I think that the more you invest in science and just being outside and caring about nature, the more we're going to be cared for, and that seems like a healthy system.
No, thank you. And that, I love it. I love it. So thank you so much for sharing your experiences with us. And I know you've also shared some links and resources with our team that we will post along with this video. So for anybody watching, if they want to kind of get in on the action a little bit, both, you know, with iNaturalist and a couple other resources that Hannah has shared, definitely go online and check that out. And likewise, I mean, get ideas for getting yourself out there, getting your family out there. Thank you for all of that and sharing your experience with us. And yeah, I guess that wraps it up for us. And I guess that's it. So thank you. See you guys next time. Bye-bye.